The casket was wrong. Not the style, not the color, but something deeper that I couldn't place as I stood there in my black dress, staring at what was supposed to be my father's final resting place. The mahogany gleamed under the funeral home's fluorescent lights, but it felt hollow somehow, like an echo of what we'd chosen just 3 days before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone else seemed focused on their grief, on saying goodbye to Dad, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The weight looked different when the pallbearers lifted it. The sound it made when they set it down seemed too light, too resonant, like tapping on an empty box rather than solid wood. I first noticed something was off during the viewing the night before the service. Mom and I had spent weeks selecting Dad's casket at Serenity Memorial Gardens, the most respected funeral home in our small town of Millbrook. We'd chosen the heritage model, a beautiful solid mahogany piece with brass handles and ivory silk lining. Dad had been a carpenter his whole life, and we wanted something that honored his craftsmanship and love for fine wood. But standing there that Thursday evening, looking down at him in what should have been his final bed, something nagged at me. The interior looked different somehow. The silk lining seemed cheaper, with a different sheen than what I remembered. The brass handles, which had been substantial and warm to the touch when we'd selected them, now felt lighter and had a slightly different color tone. I mentioned it to Mom, but she was understandably overwhelmed with grief and the logistics of losing her husband of 42 years. She brushed off my concerns, saying that lighting and emotion could play tricks on perception. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was looking for problems because accepting Dad's death felt impossible. The funeral director, Mrs. Chen, had been nothing but professional throughout the entire process. She'd guided us through every decision with compassion and expertise, and Serenity Memorial had handled 3 generations of funerals for families in our area. They had an impeccable reputation. Yet something in my gut kept insisting that what I was seeing wasn't what we'd paid for. After the viewing, I stayed behind while Mom went home to rest. I told Mrs. Chen I wanted a few more minutes alone with Dad, which wasn't unusual. Many families requested private time. But instead of grieving, I found myself examining the casket more closely. I ran my fingers along the wood grain, studying the construction. Having grown up watching Dad work with wood, I knew quality craftsmanship when I saw it. This wasn't it. The wood grain was wrong. What should have been solid mahogany showed signs of veneer work. The joinery was different, less precise than what we'd admired in the showroom. Even the brass fixtures, when I looked closely, showed slight discoloration that suggested plating rather than solid brass. I convinced myself I was imagining things. Grief does strange things to perception, and I'd been running on 3 hours of sleep since Dad's sudden heart attack 5 days earlier. The stress of funeral arrangements, managing Mom's emotions, and dealing with my own loss was clearly taking its toll. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the casket, about the subtle differences I'd noticed. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself Googling funeral home casket switching on my phone, feeling both foolish and compelled. What I found made my blood run cold. Article after article detailed cases of funeral homes substituting cheaper caskets for the expensive ones families had selected and paid for. The practice was more common than I had ever imagined, taking advantage of grieving families who were too overwhelmed to notice discrepancies. The perpetrators banked on the fact that once a casket was buried or cremated, there would be no evidence of their fraud. One article from a consumer protection website mentioned that reputable casket manufacturers had started using inventory tracking systems with serial numbers to combat this exact problem. Each casket received a unique identifier that matched purchasing records and could verify authenticity. I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the receipt from our casket purchase. There, in small print at the bottom, was a line I hadn't noticed before. Heritage Model H2847, serial number MM44297821. The manufacturer was listed as Millbrook Memorials, a company I'd never heard of, but that sounded suspiciously local. My hand shook as I searched for Millbrook memorials online. The company existed, but their website looked hastily constructed and lacked the professional polish I'd expect from a casket manufacturer. Their product line was limited, and the heritage models shown in the catalog looked noticeably different from what we'd selected at Serenity Memorial. The pieces were starting to form a terrible picture, but I needed proof. I couldn't accuse Mrs. Chen of fraud based on gut feelings and late-night internet research. More importantly, I couldn't put Mom through additional trauma unless I was absolutely certain something wrong had occurred. The next morning, the day of Dad's funeral, I arrived at Serenity Memorial early under the pretense of wanting to ensure everything was perfect for the service. Mrs. Chen welcomed me warmly and offered her condolences once again. She seemed genuinely caring, which made what I was contemplating even more difficult. I asked if I could have another moment alone with Dad before the other mourners arrived. Mrs. Chen graciously agreed and left me in the viewing room. My heart pounded as I searched for any kind of manufacturer marking on the casket. Most people wouldn't think to look for such things, but Dad had taught me that quality craftsmen always signed their work somehow. I found it inside the casket lid, barely visible unless you knew where to look, a small engraved plate with a serial number. MM77342109. Not the number from our receipt. The casket we'd paid for and the casket holding my father were not the same. How many other families had been deceived during their most vulnerable moments? The funeral proceeded as planned because I couldn't bear to create a scene on the day we were supposed to honor Dad's memory. I sat through the service feeling like I was living in two realities, one where we were celebrating my father's life, and another where I was uncovering what appeared to be systematic fraud targeting bereaved families. During the graveside service, I watched them lower what I now knew was a substitute casket into the ground, and I made a silent promise to Dad that I wouldn't let this stand. If Serenity Memorial was cheating families during their darkest hours, they needed to be stopped. After the burial, after the reception, after the last guest had gone home and Mom had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started planning my next move. I had a serial number that didn't match our receipt, a casket that wasn't what we'd purchased, and a funeral home with a 40-year reputation that might be built on lies. The question was, how deep did this go and how many other families had been victimized? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Mom assumed I needed time to process Dad's death, which wasn't entirely untrue, but my real mission was far more complicated. I'd spent the night researching consumer protection laws and funeral home regulations, and what I'd learned made my stomach churn. I started with the manufacturer listed on our receipt. Heritage Casket Company had been in business for over 60 years and had detailed records of every product they'd ever made. When I called their customer service line and explained that I needed to verify a purchase for insurance purposes, they were surprisingly helpful. The woman on the phone, Patricia, asked for the serial number from our receipt. After a few minutes of clicking through their database, she came back with information that confirmed my worst fears. The serial number, MM44297821, belonged to a heritage mahogany casket that had been shipped to Greenfield Memorial Funeral Home in the next county over, not to Serenity Memorial in Millbrook. My voice stayed steady as I asked Patricia about the serial number I'd photographed from Dad's actual casket. She put me on hold for what felt like an eternity. When she returned, her tone had shifted from helpful to concerned. That serial number belonged to their budget pine model, a casket that retailed for less than a quarter of what we'd paid for the heritage mahogany. Patricia asked if there had been some kind of mix-up with the funeral home, and I told her I was trying to figure that out myself. She offered to send me documentation of both caskets' specifications and shipping records, which I gratefully accepted. Before hanging up, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. They've been tracking an increase in serial number inquiries from families who suspected casket switching over the past 2 years. Armed with this information, I drove to the county courthouse to research Serenity Memorial's business records. As a public relations manager for a nonprofit, I knew how to navigate bureaucratic systems and access information that most people wouldn't think to look for. What I found in the business filing records painted a picture that started making terrible sense. Mrs. Chen hadn't owned Serenity Memorial for its entire 40-year history. She'd purchased the business 18 months ago from the original family who had run it since the 1980s. The timing coincided perfectly with Heritage Casket Company's increase in serial number inquiries from suspicious families. More concerning was what I found in the court records. 3 families in the past year had filed complaints against Serenity Memorial with the State Funeral Board, alleging various forms of misconduct. 2 complaints mentioned discrepancies in casket quality, though neither had been thoroughly investigated. The 3rd complaint involved unauthorized charges appearing on a family's credit card after their mother's funeral. I photographed every document I could find and spent the afternoon calling the families who had filed complaints. The first 2 numbers were disconnected, but the 3rd call connected me with Maria Santos, whose mother had been buried by Serenity Memorial 8 months earlier. Maria's story was eerily similar to mine. They'd selected an expensive bronze casket for their mother, but something seemed wrong during the viewing. The casket looked different from what they'd chosen in the shoe room, but Mrs. Chen had assured them that lighting and emotional stress could affect perception. Maria had accepted the explanation, but the unauthorized charges that appeared later had prompted her formal complaint. When I described what I'd discovered about the serial numbers, Maria became quiet for a long moment. Then she asked if I was planning to do something about it. The resignation in her voice told me that her complaint to the state board had gone nowhere, and she'd given up hope of getting justice for her mother. That evening, I called my college roommate Jessica, who had become an investigative journalist for the state newspaper. I'd been hesitant to involve the media without more evidence, but Maria's defeated tone convinced me that official channels might not be enough. Jessica listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who recognized a significant news story. She asked probing questions about documentation and evidence, then told me she wanted to pursue this as a full investigation. However, she needed more than one family's experience to build a compelling case. We needed to find other victims and gather concrete evidence of systematic fraud. Jessica suggested we work together to build an airtight case before confronting Mrs. Chen or going public. She had contacts in law enforcement who specialized in consumer fraud, and she knew how to research business records in ways that might reveal the scope of the operation. Over the next 3 days, we developed a strategy that felt like something from a crime drama. Jessica would research Serenity Memorial's vendor relationships and financial records, while I focused on finding more families who might have been victimized. We created a timeline of Mrs. Chen's ownership and started mapping complaint patterns. The breakthrough came when Jessica discovered that Serenity Memorial had been purchasing large quantities of budget caskets while maintaining a showroom full of premium models. Their ordering patterns showed that they were buying 10 budget caskets for every premium casket they showcased, despite their premium-focused marketing materials. More damning was their relationship with a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Serenity Memorial had been renting a large warehouse space for the past 18 months, coinciding exactly with Mrs. Chen's purchase of the business. Jessica's contact at the storage company confirmed that the facility was being used to store caskets, but couldn't provide details about the specific inventory. I suggested we needed to see inside that warehouse, but Jessica wisely pointed out that we needed law enforcement involvement for any evidence to be legally admissible. She arranged a meeting with Detective Williams, who specialized in consumer fraud cases for the county sheriff's department. Detective Williams was initially skeptical when we presented our findings. Funeral home fraud wasn't uncommon, but the scale of what we were suggesting would require significant resources to investigate properly. However, when Jessica showed the ordering patterns and storage facility records, his demeanor shifted to genuine interest. He asked if we'd be willing to work with his department to gather additional evidence. A plan he outlined was both thrilling and terrifying. I would return to Serenity Memorial under the pretense of planning a pre-need funeral arrangement for myself while wearing a wire to record any conversations with Mrs. Chen. The idea of confronting the woman who had deceived us during Dad's funeral made my stomach churn, but Detective Williams assured me that I wouldn't be in danger.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Chen wasn't considered violent, just unethical, and he would have backup nearby at all times. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in Mrs. Chen's office, wearing a recording device smaller than a quarter taped to my chest, discussing my own hypothetical funeral arrangements. Mrs. Chen was as professional and compassionate as she'd been during Dad's funeral, which made the deception feel even more heinous. I asked detailed questions about casket options and pricing, then mentioned that I'd heard some funeral homes had been having supply chain issues with premium caskets. Mrs. Chen assured me that Serenity Memorial maintained excellent vendor relationships and always delivered exactly what families ordered. The irony of her statement, knowing what I knew about Dad's casket, was almost overwhelming. I pressed gently about their inventory management, asking how they ensured the right casket reached the right family. Mrs. Chen explained their supposedly foolproof system, describing procedures that sounded professional but didn't account for the serial number discrepancies we documented. When I left her office an hour later, I had recorded a conversation that painted Mrs. Chen as either remarkably incompetent or deliberately deceptive. Detective Williams would determine which interpretation better fit the evidence we'd gathered. That evening, Detective Williams called to tell me that they had enough evidence to seek search warrants for both the funeral home and the storage facility. The investigation was moving beyond anything I'd imagined when I first noticed something wrong about Dad's casket. As I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at the photos of serial numbers on my phone, I realized that seeking justice for Dad had uncovered something much larger than a single switched casket. We were potentially exposing a systematic operation that had been deceiving grieving families for over a year, stealing from them during their most vulnerable moments. The woman I'd trusted to honor my father's memory had turned his funeral into a crime scene. And tomorrow, the police would finally have the evidence they needed to prove it. The raid happened at dawn on Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Dad's funeral. Detective Williams called me at 5:30 to let me know they were moving forward with the search warrants. I drove to a parking lot 3 blocks from Serenity Memorial, where Jessica was already waiting with her camera and recording equipment. From our vantage point, we watched as unmarked police cars surrounded both the funeral home and the storage facility simultaneously. Detective Williams had coordinated with the county prosecutor's office to ensure they had enough personnel to secure all potential evidence before anything could be destroyed or moved. The first shock came within an hour. Detective Williams radioed that the storage facility contained over 200 caskets, ranging from high-end mahogany and bronze models to the cheapest pine boxes available. More importantly, they'd found detailed records showing which premium caskets had been switched with budget alternatives for which families. Dad wasn't Mrs. Chen's only victim. The records showed that over 80 families in the past 18 months had been given cheaper caskets than what they'd purchased and buried their loved ones unknowingly. The financial scope was staggering, with Mrs. Chen pocketing an estimated $400,000 through the systematic fraud. When they brought Mrs. Chen out of the funeral home in handcuffs, she looked smaller and older than I remembered. Gone was the composed, professional woman who had guided us through Dad's funeral arrangements. Instead, she appeared broken and defeated, as if she'd been expecting this moment for months. Detective Williams allowed me to observe the initial interrogation from behind one-way glass. Mrs. Chen sat silently for nearly an hour before finally agreeing to speak with her attorney present. What she revealed over the next 3 hours painted a picture that was both more complex and more heartbreaking than I had expected. Mrs. Chen's husband had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer 2 years earlier. Their insurance had covered basic treatment, but the experimental therapies that offered any hope of extending his life cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Facing the choice between bankruptcy and losing her husband, she'd made a decision that seemed logical at the time. She started small, switching just 1 or 2 caskets per month and using the profit to pay for her husband's treatments. The families never knew because the caskets were buried immediately, destroying any evidence of the substitution. The plan was supposed to be temporary, just until her husband recovered, or they found alternative funding for his care. But her husband's condition worsened despite the expensive treatments, and Mrs. Chen found herself trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape. Each month brought new medical bills, new experimental options, new reasons to continue the fraud that had started as a desperate attempt to save the man she'd loved for 37 years. Her husband had died 4 months earlier, never knowing how his wife had financed his final treatments. Mrs. Chen had continued the casket switching even after his death, telling herself she needed to recoup the money she'd borrowed against her retirement accounts and the funeral home's assets. Listening to her confession, I felt an unexpected wave of sympathy that conflicted sharply with my anger over what she'd done to Dad and the other families. Her motivation wasn't greed or callousness, but a desperate love that had driven her to rationalize increasingly harmful choices. The detective asked Mrs. Chen about specific families, including ours. She remembered Dad's funeral clearly and seemed genuinely remorseful when describing how she'd substituted the budget pine casket for the mahogany heritage model we'd selected. She admitted that she'd become skilled at deflecting families' questions about quality differences, using their grief and emotional vulnerability to avoid closer scrutiny. What disturbed me most was learning how systematic and calculated the operation had become. Mrs. Chen had developed detailed profiles of which families were most likely to notice discrepancies and which were too overwhelmed by grief to ask questions. She'd specifically targeted older clients and families dealing with sudden deaths, believing they would be less likely to challenge her explanations. The legal consequences came swiftly. Mrs. Chen was charged with consumer fraud, grand theft, and violation of state funeral home regulations. The prosecutor's office announced they were seeking restitution for all affected families, though recovering the money would be complicated by Mrs. Chen's debts and the funeral home's compromised financial position. More challenging was the emotional aftermath for the families involved. Detective Williams contacted everyone identified in Mrs. Chen's records, explaining what had happened and offering resources for those who wanted to pursue civil action. The response ranged from fury to heartbreak to resignation.
Maria Santos, the woman I'd spoken with earlier, called me after receiving the detective's call. She cried on the phone, not from anger, but from validation. She'd known something was wrong during her mother's funeral, but had been made to feel foolish for questioning the professionals. Learning that her instincts had been correct provided a strange form of closure. Other families struggled more intensely with the revelation. Several had held graveside services where they'd found comfort in knowing their loved ones rested in the beautiful caskets they'd carefully chosen. Discovering that reality was different created a secondary grief that was almost unbearable. The local news coverage was extensive, with Jessica's articles leading to a broader investigation of funeral home practices statewide. Her reporting earned recognition for exposing an industry vulnerability that affected vulnerable families across multiple counties. More importantly, it prompted legislative changes requiring better oversight of funeral home inventory and stricter penalties for consumer fraud in the death care industry. For me, the resolution brought a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, and Mrs. Chen would face consequences for her actions. The other families had learned the truth about their experiences. New regulations would protect future families from similar fraud. But Dad was still gone, and knowing that his final resting place hadn't been what we'd intended added another layer of lost process. Mom struggled particularly hard with the revelation, feeling that we'd somehow failed Dad by not protecting him even in death. I visited Dad's grave on the 1-month anniversary of his funeral, bringing flowers and a small wooden cross he'd carved years earlier. Standing there, I realized that what mattered most wasn't the casket, but the love we'd put into honoring his memory. Mrs. Chen had stolen money and violated our trust, but she couldn't diminish the life Dad had lived or the impact he had on everyone who knew him. The civil lawsuit took 8 months to resolve. Mrs. Chen's assets were liquidated to provide partial restitution to the affected families. We received about 60% of what we'd lost financially, though no amount of money could compensate for the violation of trust during such a vulnerable time. Mrs. Chen received 3 years in state prison and was permanently barred from working in the funeral industry. Her sentencing hearing was difficult to attend, but I felt I owed it to Dad and the other families to see the process through to completion. During her final statement, Mrs. Chen looked directly at me and apologized specifically for what she'd done during Dad's funeral. She acknowledged that grief and desperation didn't excuse her choices and that she'd violated the sacred trust families placed in funeral professionals during their darkest moments. I never responded to her apology, not because I was unmoved by it, but because forgiveness felt premature. Time might eventually allow me to separate her human desperation from her harmful actions, but that day hadn't arrived yet. The experience changed how I approach trust and vulnerability in ways that extend far beyond funeral arrangements. I've become more questioning of authority figures and more insistent on documentation and verification, even when dealing with respected institutions. Mom and I eventually found peace with what happened, focusing on celebrating Dad's life rather than dwelling on how his death had been exploited. We established a small scholarship fund in his name for students pursuing carpentry and woodworking, channeling our grief into something positive that honored his passion for craftsmanship. Sometimes I still think about Mrs. Chen and wonder if there might have been another way to handle her husband's illness without victimizing grieving families. But then I remember the detailed records she kept, the calculated targeting of vulnerable clients, and the months she continued the fraud even after her husband died. Love can drive people to desperate choices, but desperation doesn't justify betraying the trust of families seeking comfort and dignity during their greatest losses. That's a lesson I'll carry with me forever, along with the knowledge that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we need to watch most carefully. 3 years have passed since that terrible discovery, and I can finally visit Dad's grave without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal that once accompanied every memory of his funeral. The headstone we chose still stands as a testament to the man he was, regardless of what lay beneath it in those first months after his burial. Mom remarried last spring to Harold, a retired teacher who treats her with the kindness she deserves. They live in a cottage near the lake where Dad used to take us fishing, and she's found happiness again in ways I wasn't sure would be possible. Harold never knew Dad, but he listens patiently when Mom shares stories about their decades together. The scholarship fund we created has helped 12 students pursue careers in carpentry and woodworking. Each recipient receives a small wooden plaque that Dad carved in his workshop, along with a letter explaining his dedication to quality craftsmanship. It feels like the most fitting tribute we could have arranged, honoring his skills and values rather than dwelling on how others tried to profit from his death. Jessica's investigative series won a state journalism award and led to comprehensive reforms in funeral home oversight. Random audits now occur quarterly, and casket manufacturers must provide detailed tracking documentation for every product sold to funeral homes. The changes came too late to help our family, but they've prevented countless others from experiencing similar violations of trust. I've learned to recognize the signs of institutional deception in other areas of life, questioning credentials and demanding documentation when something feels uncertain. The experience taught me that reputation and professional appearance don't guarantee integrity, and that asking difficult questions isn't disrespectful when protecting yourself or your family. Mrs. Chen was released from prison last year and moved to another state to live with her sister. I heard through Detective Williams that she works at a flower shop now, far removed from any position where she could exploit grieving families. Part of me hopes she's found genuine peace and uses her remaining years to make amends in whatever way possible. The detective still calls occasionally to update me on related cases that have emerged from our investigation. The ripple effects continue expanding as other victims come forward and law enforcement agencies share information across state lines. What started as one daughter noticing something wrong about her father's funeral has exposed a broader pattern of exploitation that affects thousands of families nationwide. Sometimes I wonder if I dismissed my initial suspicions as grief-induced paranoia. How many more families would Mrs. Chen have deceived? How much longer would the fraud have continued undetected? That thought reinforces my belief that trusting your instincts, even when others dismiss your concerns,
can prevent tremendous harm to innocent people. Dad's workshop still sits behind the house where I grew up, exactly as he left it. Mom couldn't bear to change anything, and now Harold has started learning woodworking using Dad's tools. There's something beautifully circular about his equipment being used to create, rather than remembered in connection with the deception that followed his death. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.